Today we'll see a bit of the history of complexity and, let's say, different approaches that came before it. And if we go to ancient times, there are different worldviews that favor stasis versus change. In Let's say in Europe and the Americas, we get taught a lot about ancient Greece. So that's what we know from that period of time, but very probably in other parts of the world, they had similar ideas. Uh, and let's say the example we're familiar with, it's Parmenides, who would basically have a worldview where the things that are always there, and those that are not there, they're never there. So there's not much space for change. And a bit in an opposition with Heraclit that would say that everything is in flow, that nothing repeats. We cannot get in the same river twice, and everything is changing. And let's say a modern analogy of this distinction, it's not that one is right and the other is wrong. Basically, they describe different aspects of the world. So let's say in mathematics that we have dynamical system theory, we have states, and those are like snapshots um, of an observation. And then we have processes that could be seen as transitions from one state to another, what takes us from one state to another state. So it's not that if we have a description just telling about the states and another description just about the processes, we'll have a full description. We need both. So, I mean, that has become clear after centuries of other development in different fields. And in any case, we can say that there have been many different descriptions of the world, and then these are different narratives. And also through the history of our species, we can identify three big revolutions, the agricultural, industrial, and informatic. We can say that each of these dealt with the control of matter, the first one, energy, the second one, and information, the latter one. And of course, each of these had huge effects on the way we live and on the way we describe our world and on our narratives. And these changes are still obvious. And I mean, we will revise what are the implications of the information revolution in the sense that, for example, the study of complex systems is relatively recent, not because people did not realize the importance of complexity, but just didn't have the proper tools to study them. So just like before telescopes, with our naked eye, we can only see until Saturn. And without microscopes, we cannot see microorganisms that cause infectious disease. Then it's impossible to describe galaxies if you don't have telescopes or exoplanets. It's difficult to have vaccines if you don't have microbes, although there were vaccines before microscopes, but I mean, that's another story. And even 200 years after microscopes, let's say it took 200 years with microscopes so that the germ theory of disease was fully accepted. So let's say it's not so trivial. And in the beginning of the information revolution, around the middle of last century, cybernetics was developed, and let's say cybernetics looks more at the information of a system rather than at its matter and its energy. But still, there are many antecedents to cybernetics in the sense that there was some focus on information, but let's say without digital computers, this was rather limited because, let's say, in our tiny brains, we can have maybe 2 or 3 variables. And if we have maybe huge blackboards, we can't do much more. So we are limited by it. But let's say the concepts that were developed in cybernetics have its root. So for example, the word itself comes from the Greek Kubernetes. That means steersman. So in a ship with sails, let's say you cannot control precisely or say precisely to the ship which direction, which trajectory to go, because it depends on the currents, on the waves, on the wind, and then the steersman has to kind of take everything into consideration so that the result of the steering with the wind, with the waves, with the tides and so on gives a desired trajectory. But it's a bit like teenagers that we cannot tell them precisely, do this, don't do that, because they're somehow gaining autonomy. But we just kind of try to keep them out of trouble and somehow within some decent boundaries to evolve. So let's say Plato in his Republic already spoke about self-governance. In engineering, there are examples of water clocks or devices that used the power of steam or wind. In China, there was this clock tower, which let's say it's also using concepts of cybernetics, which is basically control. And later in France, Ampere, who is better known for his contributions to electricity, to the study of electricity, wrote a treatise on cybernetic, which he defined as the science of governance. So it was more for political science and how a country should rule itself. But he already used this term inspired from the Greek Kubernetes. And in Europe, in the late 15th, during the 16th, 17th centuries, that different countries started exploring and colonizing other parts of the world. They needed precise clocks to make maps, because if you are navigating and you are kind of guiding yourself by the stars, the latitude you can estimate, let's say at the dawn, which stars or where the sun is and things like that, you can estimate it. But then the longitude, you can't, because let's say the Earth is rotating like this. So if you are moving east or west, and then the Earth is rotating and you don't know at which speed you're moving, because let's say you are sailing in a ship and it's not constant speed because it depends on the wind and the currents and so on. So you don't know how much distance you moved. So then you see that the stars moved a bit. Then you don't know how much you moved a bit. So then that's why maps of the 15th, 16th century are with not the precise proportions. So in order to calculate the longitude properly, you need timekeeping so that you know, oh, it has been, I don't know, 78 hours since the last measurement, and then let's say the difference in the stars is like that. It means that we traveled this distance, and then you can start building maps like that. Later, they built devices that didn't require that, but let's say that was the original motivation for why Europeans started building clocks with higher precision. And then this technology of clockmakers allow them to do some more sophisticated things that if you go to some European cities, you still see some clock towers like in Prague. And they have this automata, and basically they are pre-programmed to do some movements. And for example, Vaucanson in France did build this dog, which was like a toy, but it was able to eat and move its wings and defecate, and expensive toy. And Jacques Toros made this automata that would play music, but then somewhere in Spain, raging crowd destroyed them because they accused him of playing God, that he was building artificial humans. And but anyway, that eventually led to robots, but we will see that later. And in the Industrial Revolution, there were many feedback mechanisms that were used, and that's also a central concept in cybernetics. Wallace, that was contemporary of Darwin and also contributed to the theory of evolution, he also spoke about feedback. Maxwell in physics and Jakob von Wexel in ethology spoke about the Umwelt or environment of animals, noticing that it's different for different animals in the sense that a clam or a honeybee will perceive the world very different from how we do it, simply because they have different sensors. And let's say this idea of how process information and how behavior is decided by nervous system or by a control system, it's central in cybernetics. And already in the 20th century, there were many developments in mechanics, electricity, and electronics, and that, let's say, led also to more sophisticated control of these machines. And different logics were developed, more sophisticated, let's say, more than Aristotelian logic that was used since ancient times. And also some early neuroscience with Ramon y Cajal and others, and also evolutionary theory was developed. And there's this idea that so back in the late 50s, early 60s, the transistor was developed. So you might know that before, radios and all other electronic devices used bulbs, which are like the light bulbs that probably you still got to know, but with different properties, so that they would act like, let's say, what transistors do now. But let's say they were big, and then they would go out just like a light bulb. And the first killer app of transistors was portable radio, because before, radios were like big boxes because of all these big components. So the transistor allowed the miniaturization of that technology that now, I mean, you can buy already for several decades, like little kid's toy to build your own radio receiver. And it's like pretty basic circuits, but still each component was like heavy. So radio, some people say that the generation of the 60s that basically had a big change compared to their parents was possible because of the portable radio. Because imagine listening to the Rolling Stones or the Beatles in the family radio, that would not be possible. So only when people were able to listen to their own music, then that allowed the generations to change. I mean, there are other arguments that like post-war kids and things like that. But let's say it's interesting to ponder how this technology, which was developed, allowed for new uses that eventually led in part to huge changes in behavior in the 60s. In the sense that all the music that was developed in that time, let's say, managed to propagate because of the technology that was there. Just like the technology we have now allows different media, different messages, different art forms to spread. And already in the middle of the 20th century, let's say, there was much development during Second World War. The Bell Labs, which is now AT&T, was developing lots of technology for telecommunications before and after that time. There was also in management, Jay Forrester from MIT was developing system dynamics, which is related. And I'll mention the first neural networks, and also the study of purpose by Rosenbluth, Wiener, and Bigelow that we will read for next week. So we'll discuss more about that. Okay, so now I'll tell a bit about different people and what they contributed for the study of complex systems, or let's say the prehistory of complexity. So Ludwig von Bertalanffy was from Austria, and he developed so-called general systems theory. And it was what we now normally speak as systems. We kind of understand what it is. Basically, we have general principles to describe different phenomena, and these are substrate independent. And this was relevant because before, people would describe, let's say, biology in terms of what makes a biological organism. So let's say you count the legs of an insect or an arachnid, and then you classify them according to those things. If you're a chemist, then you look at the components of molecules, and then you look at atoms and things like that. If you are, let's say, a sociologist, you look at humans. So there was there was not so much possibility to take knowledge from one field to another, simply because they were speaking different languages. And it seems that general systems theory was the first one that could be used to describe different phenomena at different scales, and that's what complex systems still does. So in a sense, we can say that, let's say, we have inherited that perspective. But before that, what's a system? Any brave souls?
Collection of the collection of different bodies that are working together to achieve some sort of goal.
Yep. Yeah, it comes from Latin systema, which comes from the Greek systema. So it's like, it's not, the word is not new, and the use was always like that. So Aristotle also speaks about systems, but let's say this idea of general system theory and a mathematical formalization of it, more or less, it's from these times. So examples of systems. Human body, components interacting. Yeah.
Teleportation.
Yeah. What would be the components?
Yeah. Or bosses and bosses monkey.
Bosses. Some people like to consider passengers. Some people don't like to consider passengers as part of the system. What would be the components?
And the humidity in the air, like what causes a storm to start, what factors play into it.
Drive space in the system.
Yep. Computer systems.
Hospital systems, all different specialties working together to find diagnosis for patients.
So, sorry, could you please repeat?
I said hospital systems.
Yeah.
Everyone working together to find a diagnosis for a patient.
Yep.
Maybe an airport system.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I didn't specify that this should function efficiently, but yeah. Is that I arrived last night 20 hours later than I intended, so. But weather, an airport. Sorry? Healthcare system. I mean, of course, all the concepts with the word system, there are system, but yeah, maybe it's too easy because we can't see them everywhere. So solar system, a digestive system, yeah, education system. So maybe, do you have examples of non-systems?
Coffee.
Coffee, but it's composed of molecules, water, caffeine. I don't know what else. Hmm? Well, yeah, they're composed of fermions. Hmm? Words, letters, quarks. So yeah, there's the question whether elementary particles are really elementary, just like people thought that atoms. I mean, in Greek it means non-divisible, and then it turns out that they were divisible. And the thing with elementary particles, it's not that we know that they cannot be divided, but the energy required to collide, let's say, quarks or electrons is so huge that we don't know. And also the technology to detect what they will be made of, yeah, we also have no idea. So it might be that elementary particles are elementary, and it might be that they're composed of something else. Other examples?
Yeah.
An element in topology?
Yeah.
Like, so yes, within the contexts that you kind of already define everything else, but then it's like I mean, I'll use the example of words in a dictionary. That if we want to learn another language and we just read a dictionary, it's not very useful. Actually, there's a short story by Boris Vian from the 1950s about, it's futuristic in the 1980s, but it was written like 30 years earlier, about a robot that basically is able to hold information of a whole book. And it's like, okay, yeah. No, encyclopedia, well, the Larousse, the big book. But then the idea is that once the robot acquired that information, he already was able to speak. And the problem is that in a dictionary, if you don't know anything about another language, assuming that you know the alphabet, you read one word and then the definition is in terms of other words. But if you don't know those words, then you start searching for those words and they're defined in terms of more words, and then you search those words and then they end up being defined by the words that you already were searching. And let's say this bootstrapping is not enough, because it's what is known as the symbol grounding problem. What gives meaning to symbols? So in a similar way, one could say that for an element in topology itself, you can say that it's not a system, but in order to describe it, then you need mathematics, and that's the system. So in sense that, yeah, cannot be divided, but it's not separated. So, but then, yeah, you could say it's a no. Well, there are other examples of non-systems, like is red a system? And then it depends also on what we mean by red, because it's like a concept, but then is a property, and then can you divide it and then it becomes fuzzy. But anyway, we can use this definition of Ashby. System is a set of variables sufficiently isolated to stay constant long enough for us to discuss it, which is like fancy way of not saying much, but can be working definition. Okay, So back to cybernetics. In 1948, Norbert Wiener published a book with the same title. And it was dedicated to Arturo Rosenbluth, who was from Mexico. And I'll tell you a bit of their story. So Arturo Rosenbluth was trained as a doctor in France, actually with Walter Cannon, who defined homeostasis. And then that concept, Rosenbluth brought it into cybernetics from physiology, and he was teaching in Harvard. But then I've heard different versions of this story. So one that he was roommates, another just that he was friends, a third one that well, there was some romantic triangle, but that's a different story, and it's not relevant for this. But anyway, Manuel Sandoval Vallarta, who was a Mexican physicist working at MIT, actually, he was studying cosmic rays, and Richard Feynman's first paper was with Sandoval Vallarta, so it's more or less from that time. He told Rosenbluth, "Oh, there's this bright guy in MIT," because Rosenbluth was in Harvard, and Sandoval Vallarta was in MIT. There's this guy, Norbert Wiener, you should go and speak with him. And Rosenbluth listened, and they started collaborating. And from the stories I've heard, collaboration was not only in classrooms, but also in bars, either Cambridge or Mexico City. And actually, the book Cybernetics is dedicated to Arturo Rosenbluth. And yeah, there are more details and more gossip to this story, but I'll skip some of them because it's not that important. But anyway, Warren McCulloch was also at MIT, and he was together with Wiener in the group of cybernetics, but he had a fallout because you can see he had a peculiar way of life, which Wiener's wife did not approve. And then it seems that the wife of Wiener told Wiener either something that was true or not true or something, but let's say the wife of Wiener kind of ceded some distance between them. And at the end, McCulloch ended up leading the cybernetics lab for several years. And if you can see interviews of McCulloch on YouTube, they're highly recommended. He speaks about artificial intelligence in ways that are still current. One of his students, Walter Pitts, if you watch Good Will Hunting, that's very similar story, but with a sad ending. We can say that he was a collateral damage from the fallout between Wiener and McCulloch. So in 1943, McCulloch and Pitts published their work on defining the first neural network, which basically used the idea of electronic circuits to describe neurons. So neural networks comes from them. And Walter Pitts published very few papers, but all of them brilliant. But then he was also an alcoholic, and then he died very young. And yeah. Ashby was a psychiatrist in the UK, and he made several contributions. So he has a couple of books, Design for a Brain and Introduction to Cybernetics. And later we will also mention him when we speak about self-organizing systems that he defined properly. And he's also well known for the law of requisite variety. That's a very useful concept. Well, I wouldn't call it a law because it's almost like a tautology. And basically, well, what it says is that a controller requires at least the same variety as that of which it's trying to control. So imagine a robot in a factory, and the robot needs to distinguish between 8 different bolts. So that's the variety. Let's say a synonym for a variety would be the number of states a system can have. So if the robot needs to distinguish 8 different states, 8 different bolts, or whatever, then the robot requires to have that same variety in order to act accordingly in different states. And that's like, well, yes, because if not, you will get confused and you will end up doing the same thing when you should do something different. However, many systems don't have requisite variety and fail because of that, and we are not aware of it. So an example is this classroom. So, well, it applies to all classrooms, but let's say a teacher is trying to control the students, but then the variety of the students is greater than the variety of the instructor. And then that results in many deficiencies in the educations of students. One solution, all the different solutions basically try to match the variety of the teacher to the variety of the students. One is smaller groups, so then the students imply less variety. Another is homogenizing the groups. So let's say if you divide students that are similar in different groups, then those groups will have less variety. Another is to increase the variety of the controllers. So instead of one teacher, you have several teachers for the same group. Then they can teach different things. That's what we have, let's say, secondary school, high school, and so on, as opposed to elementary school. And all of these have advantages and disadvantages, but at the end, they're precisely trying to match the variety of teacher with a variety of students. And looking not at individual students, but at the class, because if the classes would be one-to-one, then the variety would be similar, but then the cost is huge for students. Yeah, so one can say that the goal of a controller is to minimize the transmission of variety from the environment to the system, which is opposed to the goal of information transmission. That when you transmit information, you want to preserve variety. And when you are controlling, you want to reduce variety. And actually, you can say that all the technological developments of, well, not all, many of the technological developments of our species reduce variety of our environment so that it's more predictable. So in a way, the fact that we can control temperature, that we can have better control over food production, that we have better control over our healthcare, and so on, allows us to plan better, because otherwise it's like, well, what for to plan if we don't know whether there will be famine or war or storm, earthquake. So since we have, let's say, many things that are more predictable, then we can focus more on things that we were unable to focus. But then the consequence is, by doing that, then we increase the variety, because then we can do more things that before we couldn't do. And then that increases the variety and that reduces the predictability. But that we will see later about that. That's kind of one of the consequences of complexity. And you can also apply this to models, in the sense that if you want a model to describe the variety of a phenomenon, then the model should it should have at least the variety of the one that you are trying to model. Another concept that probably you're familiar with is the control loop. So you want to control something, so your controller needs sensors in order to receive information, and then that information is processed by a controller, and that controller makes a decision, and then actuators change the control somehow, and this loop continues. So you can also apply this to, let's say, animals in an environment. So they are trying to control their environment in a way. And let's say we have sensors by which we perceive the environment. And then we have nervous systems and other systems that process that information. And then we have actuators to, let's say, change our environment or act on our environment. And if that preserves the organism, then evolution selects for that. But you can apply this to companies, to governments, to cities, to robots, of course. Many systems can be described with this. Of course, it's a nice abstraction, but it has many subtle implications. And also from cybernetics, people define different control mechanisms. So you can divide between active and passive. Active, one of the active would be feedback control. So basically, there's a perturbation, a change, and then you are trying to control something, and then there's some feedback that the control imposes to reduce the effect of the perturbation. So imagine that typical controller, thermostat, tries to keep temperature, humidity, whatever, within certain range. Then a perturbation, somebody leaves a window open, and then it gets cold or hot. Then sensors detect that change in temperature. And then the thermostat actuates by switching on the heating or the air conditioning. And that may or may not be effective to bring the temperature to the desired values. In many cases, we want let's say, especially when perturbations can damage or destroy a system, we want to act before perturbations occur or perturbations reach some effect. So, for example, in healthcare, the difference between these two is treatment versus prevention. So let's say if you prevent some disease or condition, then you don't need to treat it. If you already have a disease or condition, then you have to treat it, and that would be feedback. So feed forward, it acts before the perturbation affects what you are trying to control. So going back to the thermostat, if you have a smart home, then let's say if the hour that you will arrive is predictable, then the temperature could be set in such a way that energy saves when you are not there, and once you arrive, it has perfect temperature. And then for passive control, we have buffering, that is basically a mechanism that prevents the effects of perturbations from spreading. So if you have good insulation in a house, then that acts because it controls the variations of temperature outside the house, and you don't need to do anything. In sense, that's why it's called passive. Once it's there, it becomes a property of the system to make it more robust. So usually we can have combinations of these to have successful control. So it's like from
In a simple villa on
1950
the
or
outskirts of
1951.
Bristol lives Dr.
Yep.
Gray
Are you
Walker,
clear?
a neurologist, who makes robots as a hobby. They are small, and he doesn't dress them up to look like men. He calls them tortoises. And so cunningly have their insides been designed that they respond to the stimuli of light and touch in a completely lifelike manner. This model is named Elsie, and she sees out of a photoelectric cell which rotates above her body. When light strikes the cell, driving and steering mechanism sends her hurrying towards it. If she brushes against any object in her path, contacts are operated that turn the steering away, and so automatically she takes avoiding action.
Great grandmother of Roomba. The music.
Mrs. Walter's pet is Elmer, Elsie's brother, in the darker vest. He works in exactly the same way.
The interesting thing is that they're just kind of
Dr. Walter
moving
says that his electronic
in
toys
random
work exactly as though they have a
paths.
simple two-cell nervous system,
and it's like
and
they
that with
go,
more cells they
they're
will be able
alive.
to do many more tricks. Already Elsie has one up on Elmer. When her batteries begin to fail, she automatically runs home to her kennel for charging up, and in consequence can live a much gayer life.
Much gayer life. Yeah, speaking about Roomba, they seem to do it better than mine. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, in robotics, it's useful to have all these concepts from cybernetics. Another important contributor was John von Neumann. So, I mean, he did so many things. So, yeah, I won't have time to mention everything, but he made contributions to algebra, to the foundations of mathematics. Those of you who studied computer science or engineering know about the von Neumann architecture that all machines have. So he was involved with the development of the first electronic computers. He also was studying self-replication and defined cellular automata for that, which have become basic modeling, very popular model in computer science and also in social sciences. And he was studying whether a machine could create copies of itself, and that's why he defined cellular automata. And well, he was at Princeton at the Institute for Advanced Studies, or also called the Institute of Advanced Salaries. I mean, he was born in Hungary, migrated in the 1930s, but then he collaborated. Well, he was instrumental to import into Princeton other Europeans before and during the Second World War. So he invited Einstein, he invited Kurt Gödel, and Gödel was stubborn enough so that he didn't go before the war. So when he finally decided to go, he couldn't cross the Atlantic, so he had to go through China and Japan and California. But anyway. And also, if you have heard about fractals, father of fractals, Benoit Mandelbrot, was a postdoc with Sean Feynman and with Norbert Wiener, which is like an interesting. So he also contributed to quantum mechanics. He defined with Morgenstern game theory. So also he was interested. Well, he was consulting for the defense ministry, and with game theory, he showed that, let's say, already during the Cold War, that if there would be a nuclear war, there would be mutually assured destruction. So some people say that thanks to him, there was no Third World War yet. Let's say back in the time. And Manhattan Project, so people say it was like the science fair high school science fair project of a Hungarian high school because it was full of Hungarians, also known as Martians, and many of them were like well, not many. Some of them, well, one of them was childhood friend of von Neumann, Wigner, and others were also contemporaries, and they know him from high school and things like that. In Manhattan Project that developed the atomic bomb. And Klaus Shannon, he worked together with Vannevar Bush, differential analyzer. Vannevar Bush was later the head of science in the States during and after the Second World War. And this was one of the first digital computers to be able to solve differential equations. So he was working since he was very young with digital computing. Yeah, so his master's thesis proved that you could build with Boolean logic any circuit that you would want. So that was like for many the start of computer science. He also liked to juggle. He liked trying to predict the casino. In this picture, he has a rat robot and a maze. So he was in the Dartmouth conference, not far from here in New Hampshire, that 70 years ago defined the term artificial intelligence. He was also participating in the Macy conferences of cybernetics. But he's most known for his work on information. So he has very famous paper, Mathematical Theory of Communication, where he defines what is known as Shannon information. He was visiting Princeton, and John von Neumann suggested him to use the word entropy, supposedly because nobody really understands what it is. So it's also known as Shannon entropy. And also because the equation is exactly the same as Boltzmann-Gibbs entropy used in thermodynamics. And he also contacted Einstein and Gödel, had also some interactions with Alan Turing. And Alan Turing is another of the fathers of computing. But British, and also von Neumann, Turing, Shannon, they're known as fathers of computer, but they wanted to study intelligence or the mind. And why this link between computers and intelligence? Because intelligence is basically about information processing. So you cannot really study how we process information with, let's say, gears and levers and, let's say, the tools of clockmakers. So only when we had the technology to process information at a much higher scale, then we were able to start studying the formal processes or the information processing that's required for exhibiting intelligent behavior. And a problem of artificial intelligence is that we want our machines not to make mistakes, but as Alan Turing noted, if they don't make mistakes, they won't be able to learn, and then that's an essential aspect of intelligence. So it's a bit of a conundrum. So 1936, he published a paper where he was addressing the problem of decidability posed by Hilbert, who was one of von Neumann's PhD advisors, and one of the most influential mathematicians of the 20th century. And he showed that basically no formal system can be decidable. Kurt Gödel showed in 31 that all formal systems are incomplete and inconsistent if they have enough power. and Turing did the same for decidability. And for doing that, he defined the Turing machine, which again is the basis of theoretical computing. During the Second World War, he was deciphering the Enigma machines. So if you watch this film with Benedict Cumberbatch, I forget the name of the film. Imitation Game, yeah. Which is basically the so-called Turing test. So you probably have filled CAPTCHAs. That's an inverse Turing test, because Turing tests basically, if a computer fools a human that it's a human, then it's already as intelligent as a human. And there are many problems with this definition, but let's say, because for example, already in the 80s or 90s, some programs passed the tests with naive judges, because you have an algorithm that just puts orthographic mistakes, then the evaluator would say, oh, computers don't make mistakes, then they should be a human. And they pass the tests not being smart as humans, but being dumb as humans. And it's like, that was not the idea. But yeah, he has very influential paper from 1950 where he proposed this Turing test, but he more generally discussed about whether machines can think. And then he says that this is too broad of a question, and then he poses the Turing test, but it's interesting discussion all around. And he did also other contributions. So, for example, in morphogenesis, there's this thing called Turing patterns. For example, the patterns that you find in some skins of animals. And he proposed some reaction diffusion equations that can explain those patterns. And he was gay, and it was illegal at the time in the UK to be gay. So he was in jail, and then he, in spite of his services to the crown during the Second World War, he was forced to take some medicine, so-called chemical castration, and that depressed him, and he committed suicide. So many of us wonder, oh, if he had been here, if he had more time, what could he develop? No, and same for John von Neumann. He died early. Well, many people from the Manhattan Project died of cancer because of playing with uranium and plutonium. Another British cybernetician, Stafford Beer, applied these ideas to management organizations and to countries. So there's this recent podcast called the Santiago Boys. I highly recommend it it's interesting. So in 1970, Salvador Allende was elected president of Chile, and he was socialist. So Cold War, CIA didn't want commies spreading on this side of the planet. So in 1973, there was a coup by Augusto Pinochet, backed by the CIA, and they killed Allende. But before that, in Chile, they were developing a so-called brain for the country, the CyberSim project, which basically was a control room where, I mean, if you can see pictures online of it, and it looks like the lair of the villain of a James Bond film from the 70s that at the end ends up exploding. That's control room of the CyberSim. Very modern. So the idea basically was that decision makers in the government would get real-time information with telex machines, which anybody knows what a telex machine is? Anybody knows what a fax machine is? So the telex is like the grandfather of the fax. like huge machines, and basically they print out data, but more or less like a fax. So they had like plants in different parts of Chile sending reports about the production every day, and then they had real-time information about the state of the country. And in 72, there was a strike by bus drivers, truck drivers, and with only like 50 truck drivers, the government was able to maintain the country running because they knew exactly what was needed and where it was. So let's say they were able to use this a bit. And actually, the CIA later developed a similar system in South America by all the dictatorships that were installed in those years to communicate and catch and kill the rebels, the opposition. But anyway, once the Pinochet took power, the CyberSyn project just stopped. But still, the seeds of cybernetics in Chile are produced many different outcomes. Humberto Maturana, actually, he was also in MIT in times of McCulloch. He has a paper with McCulloch and with Bigelow, who has a paper with Rosenbluth and Wiener. He was a biologist, but also philosopher of science, and he is known together with Francisco Varela for autopoiesis. And they have a paper that's something like what the frog eye tells the frog's brain, and they had some experiments where they had some frogs, and if you just give them dead flies, they will starve to death. And then if you have a small bearing in a moving quickly, the frog will try to eat it. And it's like, oh, such a dumb frog starves when there's food and tries to eat something non-edible. But let's say evolutionarily, in the umwelt of a frog, small dots that's moving with special pattern, it's food. And there are no dead flies lying around, so there's no evolutionary pressure to develop the sensors to detect dead flies. So Maturana went back to Chile and started a group, and Varela was his student. Then he went to MIT for his PhD, came back with computers, and then they started studying autopoiesis, which is one attempt at defining life with a strong cybernetic influence. And later, Varela was also studying neurophenomenology and also links between Buddhist philosophy and neuroscience. Heinz von Forster was organizer in many of the MACI conferences, and the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, he set up the Biological Computer Lab, BCL, and it seems that was the first place where something like an interdisciplinary cybernetic degree was offered. And then there are many famous people that were there: Stephen Wolfram, Chris Langton, and many others. Now I'm having doubts about Stephen Wolfram, but then anyway, Chris Langton for sure. And he noticed that when we describe a system, then the observer basically defines what are the boundaries, what are the variables. So, and depending on the observer, you will have different description of the same phenomenon. It will be a different system, but let's say it will be different description of the same phenomenon. So he, in second order cybernetics, he was applying cybernetics to study cybernetics itself, which sounds a bit hand-waving, and it is. And that's why kind of cybernetics fell out of favor because people started discussing more ideas and doing less applications. And because of that hand waviness, the people that were doing more serious research took a distance and just changed their name to what they were doing. Because then the idea of second order cybernetics is that the observer should be also part of the system. So then it's like, okay, yes, but in practical matters, it's not very useful and doesn't make much difference. And in philosophical matters, it's like, well, okay, but then in second order cybernetics, you have a second order observer, and then you need a third order cybernetics to study, and then you have a third order observer, and then so yeah. So what happened to cybernetics? They kind of faded away in a sense in these discussions, but in another way, it was absorbed together with systems science. Well, like we have the Department of System Science, which is one of the few survivors from that cybernetic era. But all disciplines use concepts developed within cybernetics and system science. And in the 1980s, to be more precise, in 1984, Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico was founded mainly from people in Los Alamos. So again, the link with the Manhattan Project. And actually, originally, it was going to be an institute about computing. But the founders decided to use the name Complexity. And in its first years, it was heavily criticized because it seemed like, oh, bunch of cool guys with Nobel Prizes just go and have fun in the high desert, and they don't invite me, so they should be wrong. So one of these criticism compare Complexity to previous disciplines that had been popular and then faded very quickly, beginning with C, including cybernetics, chaos, catastrophe theory, and then Complexity was next. But I mean, after 40 years, I would say we already passed the test of time. But yeah, whether we keep on calling it complexity or not, just like with cybernetics, the concepts developed in complex systems have been absorbed by all disciplines. And around 2004, in the European Commission started funding projects on complex systems. And then everybody's like, yeah, I'm doing complex systems, give me some money. And that kind of prompted the launch of the Complex Systems Society and the first European conferences on complex systems, which later became global. So now in China, there's renewed interest in complex systems. So let's say that's more or less the state of affairs now. But what is complexity? Well, we'll be asking this question and unsuccessfully trying to answer it the whole semester. Benoit Mandelbrot, again, the father of fractals, wrote something like all concepts worth studying defy precise definition. And what he meant is that if you can define complexity or by that any concept properly, then it should be simple enough that it's not very interesting to study it. And the same happens with life. I mean, biology, it's like, yeah, we study living systems, but what's life? Nobody can agree. What's intelligence? What's consciousness? What's mind? All these are, let's say, highly debatable. And we joke that if you have two complexity scientists, if you put them in a room, you will have three definitions of complexity. But the same in physics. Like, for example, Leibniz and Huygens asked Newton, "Oh, you speak so much about momentum, and I forget whether time and matter or something, but let's say some basic concepts in physics. You speak so much about them. Why don't you define them?" And Newton just told, "Oh, I don't need to define them, for they are well known of everybody." And it's like, no. No. And again, physicists that have different understandings of what is time, of what is matter, uh, what's energy, what's a field. Yeah. So the same we will have with complexity. We can say that etymologically comes from the Latin plexus, which means intertwined. There's analogy with the Sanskrit tantra, which could be translated as a thread, meaning that you have lots of interactions. And that's what characterizes complexity, because plexus entwined means that something is difficult to separate. What would be something difficult to separate? Well, something that has relevant interactions. So a system with relevant interactions, you can call it complex. So, for example, we might know everything about carbon atoms, but then depending on how they interact, you can have charcoal or graphite, diamonds, graphene, nanotubes, buckyballs, and so on. And all of these materials have very different properties, like graphite is dark and not very resistant. Diamond is clear and very resistant. Nanotubes of graphene are highly conductive of electricity, and so on. So you can have the same atoms, but depending on how you arrange them, you will have very different properties. And same with team sports, you can have the same elements or different elements, but depending on how you arrange them and depending on interactions, you will have very different performances of the team. And there are many implications of studying interactions, and we will see them along the course. And that's why the term collective dynamics in the course is relevant, because when you have interactions, these can generate new information that is not in initial or boundary conditions. So we were taught in high school and also in classical physics course that if you have initial and boundary conditions of a system and the laws that govern that system, you'll be able to predict. And still, we attempt to predict, I don't know, everything. And many projects that are submitted, they claim that they will be able to predict whatever, whether it's in healthcare or in finance or in engineering. It makes sense to want to predict, because this basically is like this gives us anticipation, which in cybernetics is this feed-forward control. We want to predict because we want to act before the perturbations damage the systems we're trying to control. However, with complexity, the interactions generate information that we don't have beforehand. So this gives us so-called computational reducibility, that we'll go deeper into it later, but it basically limits how much we can predict. So what do? We throw the towel and cry, or let's say what animals do, because also our prediction is limited. We adapt. So then we build adaptive systems, and then this is feedback control. But we need our systems to continue functioning while they adapt. So for that, we need robustness and anti-fragility. And that's like the robustness is buffering. So again, the same concepts from cybernetics, but we are kind of learning how to incorporate it. Okay, so for Thursday, we'll discuss Complexity Explained. Maybe you already read it. And let's say there are these concepts that we describe, and we'll be discussing them on Thursday. So if you haven't done it, check on Brightspace, because you need to upload the coursework, which is a description of this Complexity Explained. And yeah, it will make Thursday class more engaging, because otherwise I'll just be here speaking and you'll be listening, and it's more interesting if you are also participating and we have more interactions. So there are many challenges and opportunities, and in the sense that we are now able to do science which was not possible to do because we didn't have the proper tools, the technology, or the concepts. So let's say it's not like in physics that people say that, or certain fields of physics, that everything is already discovered, all the low-hanging fruit is already taken. So there's very little to do. So it's like, okay, you learn, but then you cannot contribute. And in complex systems, we are at an early stage, and of course there are challenges, but then we can do much. And again, more than a century ago, Poincaré wrote, "The aim of science is not things themselves, as the dogmatists in their simplicity think, but the relations among things. Outside this relation, there is no reality knowable." And also Richard Feynman basically said that all mass is interaction. So again, we will see more about the implications of taking interactions as something real. And another challenge, Giorgio Parisi, recent Nobel Prize, all simple systems look similar to one another, and each complex system is complex in its own way, a bit like the start of Anna Karenina. So of course, in science, we try to generalize. Almost by definition, complex systems defy generalizations. So how can we study if we cannot generalize? So it's a bit of a balance between those two extremes, but it's an interesting challenge. So for Thursday, Complexity Explained. For next week, it's described already on Brightspace, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, it's already there, right? So choose one of these 3 papers. If you want to read more, it's good. And then discuss in about 1 page, 500 words, one of them, and then we'll discuss it next week here. And you can also subscribe to Complexity Digest, which we have been editing for some time, and then you'll get the latest research and news and events related to complex systems. Okay, questions?
What's the difference between this class and the 5 or 7?
So 547, it's basically going along a book that I just finished that describes, uses the narrative of balance to describe complex systems. So it's a bit more philosophical, and this a bit more hands-on, with going deeper into the models and implementation and things like that. And for many, it's not so much of a choice, because this is like part of the system science program, and the other is optional course. Yeah. Was there other question? Yeah, there is some overlap, but there is also overlap with I forget the course that Luis Rocha teaches. It also has complexity in the title or systems. Yeah, I forget, but so it's like different approaches to complexity. But for example, the readings in all the three courses are different. So it's like, of course, we all speak about complexity, we all speak about emergence, and so on, but from different angles.
Proposition tomorrow, is it online or is it offline?
On Thursday,
Thursday.
uh,
Sorry, I think taking the seminar.
yeah. Yeah, so the Coco seminar tomorrow, it's both. So if you want pizza, come here. If not, you can join via Zoom. And if the time doesn't work for you, the video will be on Vimeo eventually.
Which classroom?
R15? Yeah. Okay. Just follow the smell of pizza. No, don't have high hopes. It's basic pizza. But anyway. Okay, so see you tomorrow or Thursday.